Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Ancient History Jewelry Stories podcast. We have started a new deep dive topic for this month, and as with the previous 2 months, July's podcasts will be a companion to the deep dive series. This month, I have clearly gotten too big for my britches as we are tackling a topic that is easily 10 times deeper than I can comfortably cover in a month of podcasts and videos. The history of jewelry as magical symbol. I had so many excited responses when I announced this topic last Wednesday, and we have a lot to talk about. This will be part 1. If you're new here, welcome. My name is Melise, and I'm a goldsmith trained in ancient techniques. I host a video series, which is also called Ancient History Jewelry Stories, where I approach our shared human history through the lens of jewelry. It can tell us a surprising amount about our ancient ancestors. For those of you who are paid Patreon members, you've got your first exclusive video at the end of June, and you will be getting another one at the end of this month. Last month's bonus video was extra background information on some of the other metals that go into jewelry fabrication besides gold and silver. This month, I'll be putting up a poll so you can all vote on what you would like the bonus episode to be about. There will also be a poll to help decide next month's deep dive topic, so if you would like the chance to vote on that, you can join the $5 a month tier at patreon.com/ancienthistoryjewelrystories. I've been talking about making merchandise for a few weeks, and I have been working on it. You will be able to find some merch at merch.shopmoonhoney.com. There isn't much there yet, but hopefully by the end of the evening or by tomorrow afternoon, you'll be seeing a few other designs for tote bags, mugs, and hopefully some stickers too, the shiny ones. And with all of that boring stuff out of the way, let's move on to the main topic. The history of jewelry as magical symbol. Last month, we covered the fascinating and at times very violent histories of gold and silver, 2 metals which have shaped societies and cultures since the dawn of humanity. I touched on a few of the ways in which these metals have symbolized divinity to various cultures, including gold's association with sun gods and silver's association with lunar goddesses. As I've covered various gemstones for the monthly birthstone video series, I've talked about various beliefs ascribed to different stones, from protection against poison to shielding one from the negative effects of too much wine. Mythology, superstition, religion, and symbolism are deeply ingrained within the very concept of jewelry, from the materials to the design. You may know of some of these beliefs, even if you don't know how ancient they truly are. Much of the world wears wedding rings on the ring finger of the left hand, because of the lingering, if incorrect, belief that the ancient Romans held, that a vein ran from your ring finger on your left hand straight to your heart. They called it the vena amoris. Taking it further, that wedding ring might be an eternity band, with stones encircling the entire finger. This, as the name suggests, is a design representing an eternal union, unbroken, and dates back to at least the 18th century. We wear infinity symbols, snakes, evil eyes. Even butterflies are an ancient and enduring symbol once used to represent the soul itself. That's not even touching on the more obvious ones. Religious symbols like crosses, crucifixes, saint medallions, the Om symbol, a Star of David, the list goes on. While we're on the topic of religious symbols, I want to make it clear here at the top of the episode that I'm not coming from any place of personal bias in this discussion. I identify as agnostic. I feel I'm not privy to enough of the secrets of our universe to make an informed decision about who or what is running the show. And as far as I'm concerned, it might all be a simulation anyway. If I come at religion with a sense of casual levity, rest assured I'm treating all religions across all times the same way. I believe every pantheon and mythology is worthy of respectful discussion, but some parts of history are undeniably hilarious. If we can all have a laugh at Zeus being a horny piece of shit, then I think we can extend the same sense of humor to other religions. At least, I can. To start the discussion about jewelry as magical symbol, we have to go all the way back to the earliest known jewelry finds. This may be shocking to some, completely unsurprising to others, but the earliest known jewelry is about 150,000 years old. It consists of a set of 33 perforated snail shells. They look very much like cowrie shells. They were found at the mouth of a cave in Morocco. While we don't have any documentation or evidence pointing to whether these beads were worn as just adornment or something more, this is, after all, prehistory. Mammoths and saber-toothed tigers were still very much a thing. They tell us something very important. They were a means of communicating something to your community and peers, maybe even to strangers. Whether it was purely an expression of self or a means of warding against some sort of misfortune or illness is lost to time, but knowing what we do know about humans and our tendency to find or put meaning in everything, big and small, I think we can make some broad assumptions. We can assume that to go to the trouble of gathering these shells, piercing them, smoothing the edges, because evidence shows that these beads were intentionally made by a craftsperson, then stringing them to wear, either as a necklace or adding them to clothing, required time and effort. They were meant to be worn in a way that was going to be seen, and as such, had to have said something about the wearer. In a time before even the earliest known stone structures, pretty early in the developmental stages of what we consider modern humans, people were taking time from their undoubtedly active and very busy lives to create objects that they could wear, objects imbued with some sort of symbolic meaning. Other examples of prehistorical pierced shell beads have been found throughout the African continent, most notably in Blombos Cave, South Africa. When these beads were discovered in 1991, they were the oldest known examples of jewelry, and were found with carved red ochre objects and elaborately carved bone tools. Much like the beads found in Morocco, some of the shells showed evidence of careful smoothing and crafting. These beads are around 82,000 years old. Since that find, older beads continued to surface, and it was theorized that similar, possibly older deposits existed in North Africa and Southwest Asia. Similar beads were found in Israel and Algeria, with the 150,000-year-old beads being excavated in Morocco between 2014 and 2018. The leap from 82,000-year-old beads to 150,000-year-old beads nearly doubles the length of time that we know for a fact humans have been taking the time, energy, and effort to create symbolic objects. We also have some stunning evidence left behind by our Neanderthal ancestors. Incredible finds in a cave in Croatia suggest that Neanderthals in the region were wearing eagle talons fashioned into bracelets and perhaps necklaces. Though these talons were excavated in the early 20th century, their importance wasn't truly understood until over a century later, when a curator noticed the distinctive cut marks and polishing that indicated that these talons were most likely worn as personal adornment. It does not take a lot of connecting the dots to understand that sharp, giant talons taken from a bird with a 6 or 7 foot wingspan, that's about 2 meters for my metric friends, would have communicated something very specific to your friends, neighbors, and enemies. Don't fuck with me. I stole these talons from an eagle. Perhaps they were also intended to imbue the wearer with the strength of the eagle. Perhaps they were intended to intimidate. They almost definitely signified some kind of rank. Before the more recent finds in Morocco, these were the earliest known human adornments. And while I appreciate the addition to our timeline of humanity with the shells found in Morocco, I can't help but think the talons are cooler than the snail shells. Sorry. For a good long while, things are firmly in the seashell, bone, talon category for personal adornment. It isn't until 70,000 years ago that we get the next unique, tremendously significant piece of symbolic personal adornment. Found in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, it's a remarkably sophisticated and well-made bracelet, fashioned out of a stone that would have been imported to the area, called green chlorite. The fragments of the bracelet hint at a few things. The stone was fragile enough that it would likely only have been worn for special occasions. It was very small and would have fit a small woman or child. And it was found with a separate carved marble ring that may have been suspended from the bracelet, possibly by a piece of copper wire from a hole that is drilled into the bangle. It was also found with the remains of a mammoth and a young girl around 7 years old, indicating that it was buried with the remains for symbolic purposes. This find is controversial for a few reasons. It comes from a time when such sophisticated objects were not thought to be made, and it's been attributed to the Denisovans, an ancient and extinct hominid species. Whether the bracelet was made by Denisovans, Neanderthals, Homo sapiens, or some blend of the three, because there was plenty of intermingling between groups of early hominids, is still unclear. The bracelet has also been dated as anywhere between 70,000 and 40,000 years old, with many researchers and archaeologists arguing that the tools and skills necessary to craft something like this would not have existed as early as 70,000 years ago. This is a good opportunity to note that a very large chunk of our understanding of prehistoric and ancient jewelry, whether as adornment or symbol or both, is colored very heavily by the fact that the majority of ancient jewelry finds come from some sort of grave, tomb, or otherwise posthumous site. There are very few sites in the world where jewelry is found on a person who was wearing it in a day-to-day context. Pompeii and Herculaneum are two of the only ones I can think of. We have to jump forward yet another 60,000 years to the oldest known gold adornments found in Varna, Bulgaria. These pieces, while much newer than the pierced shells and eagle talons of our older ancestors, are a more concrete record of symbolism and adornment in our shared history. Because these objects are purposely made out of materials reserved exclusively for that use, needing specialized tools, much like the green chlorite bracelet, we can say for sure that they required a particular level of skill and sophistication. Because these finds were excavated from a tomb, we know for sure that they had some sort of symbolic significance. These gold objects, excavated from what would become known as the Varna necropolis, date back to 4600 to 4300 BCE, a find that included more gold in this one place than had ever been found in all other archaeological sites from this time period, between 4000 and 5000 BCE, combined. There is one tomb that held the majority of all of this gold, and this one tiny tomb is known as Grave 43. This grave was initially thought to belong to a prince, but, dear listener, I want you to know how my heart swells with joy to tell you that it's since been determined to have probably belonged to a goldsmith. Given the prevalence of elaborately made gold objects found throughout the Varna necropolis, and similarly aged finds of gold objects found throughout Bulgaria, we can ascertain that a smith would have been a pretty important person to have in your community. The discovery of the Varna necropolis was entirely accidental. In 1972, a man digging trenches to lay electrical cables fished a bracelet out of the bucket of his excavator. By the end of the day, he had pulled out a few other metal pieces, but assuming they were bronze or copper, he just threw them in a shoebox and forgot about them under his bed for a couple weeks. He eventually gave this box of dirty old metal bits to his former teacher, who, by then, was running a little private museum of local artifacts. This former schoolteacher contacted the Varna Museum of Archaeology, and a couple of experts begrudgingly went out to have a look, assuming it would be a handful of just centuries-old copper coins at best, something they got calls for at least monthly and had stacks of in the museum storage rooms. What they found when they got there took their breath away. Up until that morning, all of the known gold artifacts from the Copper Age weighed a pound combined. The initial find, stuffed into a box and shoved under a bed, weighed over 2 pounds. The archaeologists immediately raced back to Varna with the gold artifacts in the same shoebox. This first set of pieces consisted of bracelets, a flat breastplate, earrings, gold tubes that may have fit around a wooden scepter handle, some rings, and what are described as, quote-unquote, other small trinkets, probably beads and spangles meant to decorate a garment. It was clear that these finds were very significant and that they likely represented the contents of a grave. It was also very clear that where you find one grave, you will very likely find more. The race was on to uncover the treasures waiting in the Varna necropolis. Over the next 15 years, archaeologists uncovered over 300 graves dating between 4200 and 4600 BCE. The majority of these graves contained no gold objects, with most of the wealth being found in just 3 graves. The one with the most wealth, grave 43, is what we want to take a closer look at. Grave 43, the one that probably belonged to a goldsmith. The first place where we can definitively start our story of jewelry as magical symbol. Something purely symbolic. The man found in grave 43 was absolutely covered in gold. There is an exact reproduction of his grave, complete with plastic skeleton, at the Varna Archaeological Museum. In this replica, they've laid out the actual gold artifacts as they were found. He was found wearing 3 strands of gold beads as necklaces, at least 6 bracelets, multiple pairs of hoop earrings, looks to me like at least 3 pairs, and he had big gold discs laid out on the top of his head. He was also found with an artifact that people get really excited about when talking about this grave, a gold penis sheath, which is surprisingly hard to say. It's more likely to have been a belt tip, but people really like the penis sheath detail, so we'll leave that one open to interpretation. He was also found surrounded by other gold objects, multiple tiny gold discs, which were likely adornments on clothing, or as I like to call them by their proper name, spangles. There were tiny gold discs found on the crests of his hips, multiple short, thin gold cylinders that likely went around some kind of a wooden handle, a necklace of carnelian beads, which he was not wearing, and he was holding a wooden war mace, or adze, with a golden handle. Every single one of these objects likely had some sort of significance, whether purely symbolic or as a magical symbol, something intended to provide strength, protection, or imbue the wearer with some special attribute. Another grave containing symbolic gold objects was grave 36. While grave 43 is a richer collection, I think the items found in grave 36 are a better example of magical symbol. Among the finds are a pair of pierced gold plaques in the shape of bulls, one smaller than the other. Grave 26 contains a single, simplified example of a very similar gold bull. These may have been worn as pendants or attached to clothing, but it's clear that they're meant to embody, or even transfer, attributes of a bull to the wearer, likely strength and virility. Because let's face it, ancient humans were very big on fertility, whether their own or that of their crops and livestock. Saw blades and shears didn't exist in the 5th millennium BCE, so objects like these had to be made using painstaking methods, including hammering out very thin sheets of gold and cutting them to shape with copper or stone chisels. Both grave 36 and 43 show an astonishing number of intricately shaped items made out of gold sheet, generally believed to have been adornments attached to clothing, again, spangles, as well as hundreds of perfectly round ring-shaped gold beads. These objects were being made for a specific person, for a specific purpose, and with tremendous skill and care. Grave 36 includes two more objects that I would argue are decidedly magical. A solid gold scepter and a solid gold handle that may have belonged to an axe. These objects would have absolutely no use as actual tools. They exist firmly in the realm of symbolic object. They were made to communicate something very specific about the rank or divinity of the person that they were buried with. Taken as a whole, the Varna necropolis represents a surprisingly prosperous and advanced Copper Age civilization living on the coast of the Black Sea. Perhaps even more surprising is the fact that this prosperous and advanced civilization seems to have occupied the area for less than 500 years. The prevailing theory is that climate change forced these people to find other areas to settle, as the surrounding land was eventually overcome by water. This civilization does also represent the first concrete evidence of a patriarchal hierarchy, so maybe that first experiment into male-dominated culture just didn't go so well. We can assume their eventual diaspora into surrounding areas and contact with surrounding cultures would have led to their own spiritual practices concerning jewelry being adopted by at least some of their neighbors. From here, we leap over to ancient Mesopotamia, a region of West Asia in what we call the Fertile Crescent today, situated between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Today, ancient Mesopotamia is known as modern-day Iraq, but in truth, the ancient empire once stretched to cover parts of present-day Iran, Turkey, Syria, and Kuwait. Mesopotamia is the home of many human firsts. The invention of the wheel, the planting of the first cereal crop, the early development of cursive script, astronomy, mathematics. It's no surprise that this is also a region of the world where jewelry was worn for adornment and symbolic purposes, and in abundance. Ancient Mesopotamian jewelry was being produced as far back as 4,000 years ago by both Akkadians and Sumerians in the cities of Akkadia and Sumer. Unlike other ancient civilizations, like Egypt, Mesopotamia did not restrict the wearing of gold to the upper classes and nobility. Instead, it was worn by everybody, indicating a fairly wealthy society. It is clear that the Mesopotamians really loved to adorn themselves. Both men and women regularly wore decorative jewelry consisting of earrings, bracelets, anklets, necklaces, pendants, cylinder seals, even gold and silver hair rings, and thin gold hair ribbons to weave into braids. Though these may all seem like pretty accessories, they also carried deeper levels of meaning. The intricate language of symbolism woven into their jewelry started with the materials chosen, which is also true of many other ancient cultures. We discussed gold at length last month, pure, untarnished, a metal that carries its own divine energy. The choice of stones also carried its own meaning, with lapis lazuli being associated with the Sumerian sky goddess Inanna, and carnelian being associated with Ishtar. Even these goddesses wear protective jewelry in their own myths, both adorning themselves with lapis and carnelian, especially Ishtar, before going into battle. Even divinity wore magical jewelry, and it was part of the image of the divine that was represented in icons, statues, and seals. For instance, Ishtar is often represented as wearing a golden halter chain, bracelets, and necklaces in images of her. To adorn yourself was to take part in an act of devotion as well as an act of beauty. A few months ago, I did a deep dive series on the royal tombs at Nimrud in ancient Mesopotamia, specifically the queen's tombs and the absurd quantity of gold jewelry found within. While discussing the history and why they needed just so much gold, I'm talking hundreds of pairs of identical earrings, we talked about Ishtar's role in all this. She can be seen as the first poster child for jewelry as important magical symbol. In the myth concerning Ishtar's descent to the underworld, she has to remove pieces of her jewelry to bribe gatekeepers along the way, ultimately robbing her of her power by the time she reaches her destination, which is to meet her sister, the goddess of the underworld. Without her jewelry, she is powerless, and she only retrieves it when she returns to the surface. The ancient queens of Nimrud were buried with heaps of jewelry, not for their own adornment in the afterlife, because they were already wearing those things on their bodies when they were buried, but as tokens to pay their way forward like Ishtar did, so they wouldn't have to remove their own jewels, which gave them divine power. It isn't a stretch to imagine that this myth, and Ishtar's literal armor of jewelry, imbued even everyday accessories with a magical quality in ancient Mesopotamia. During that deep dive, we also touched on a curse in the queen's tombs, which specifically called out the theft of jewelry, this very precious currency needed for the queen to advance through the underworld into her afterlife. It's clear that, in ancient Mesopotamia, the very concept of jewelry and personal adornment was imbued with magical symbolism. Adornment as an act of worship and divinity. The very act of wearing jewelry was a magical ritual, and each adornment was a symbol of that magic. The ancient Mesopotamians certainly blurred the lines between jewelry as adornment and jewelry as magic symbol, which I think is a good baseline for how to approach jewelry throughout quite a few ancient cultures. Speaking of other ancient cultures, Mesopotamia was importing all, if not most of its gold from Egypt, so let's go have a look at what was going on with jewelry a little further to the west. Like Mesopotamia, Egypt was a culture of adornment. Every level of social status had access to some form of jewelry, but gold, gemstones, and glass were reserved for the wealthy, while the lower classes had to make do with painted shell, pottery, bone, and animal teeth. Colors were vibrant, with copper oxides found in lapis lazuli and malachite being used to create bright blue and green pigments. This is where we start to see the emergence of a specific kind of magical symbol in jewelry, the amulet. In fact, I'd be willing to bet that when there is any mention of ancient Egyptian jewelry, most people will think of a scarab amulet, if they aren't immediately thinking of King Tutankhamun's mask, like I would. An amulet is often seen as nothing more than a pendant with a bit of superstition attached these days, but to the ancient Egyptians, it was a vital part of staying physically and spiritually safe in your everyday life. Amulets could be made out of a variety of materials, and it's likely that the majority of them were mass-produced pretty cheaply to sell to the general public. They had to be available to everybody because they were a necessary tool for health in the corporeal and spiritual realms. They were worn by people of all ages, including babies and young children, but they had even more significance after death. In ancient Egypt, there were many factors that went into determining the magical properties of an amulet, including shape, color, materials used, inscriptions, as well as any words spoken or acts performed over it. It was believed that an object could become an amulet via a magical act. Nowadays, we tend to categorize ancient amulets by shape and size, but in truth, we've lost way too much context over the intervening millennia to say with certainty whether or not most of these objects were, in fact, intended to be amulets. It's fairly obvious with some, but there are simpler pendants, talismans, rings, and adornments that may have had magical purpose initially, imbued with the power of an amulet through an act of magic, but that seem mundane to our modern eye, with absolutely no indication that they were once considered something symbolically important. Amulets could be made out of a variety of materials, with gold and semi-precious stones being reserved for the wealthy and ruling classes, while the majority of the ancient Egyptian world would probably be buying and wearing amulets made out of faience, a type of bright glazed ceramic which was very popular and easily obtained. Interestingly, bronze, a metal which was highly prized for temple donations, was not used for amulets. There's no definitive answer as to why this would have been considered a quote-unquote wrong material for amulets, but Maybe it had something to do with the perceived lack of purity of mixing copper and tin. While there are other very obvious examples of jewelry as magical symbol in ancient Egypt, I feel that the amulet is the best representation of how this belief was incorporated into daily life. The other examples we have, while exquisite, represent the burial goods of either the ruling class or the very wealthy elite, with incredibly structured and coded beliefs about what would happen to this specific set of people after their death. Remember, the elaborate mummifications and burials of ancient Egypt that we're familiar with don't represent your everyday Egyptian. And the same is true of many other ancient cultures where our knowledge of adornment is so heavily skewed by funerary practices. We can talk for days about how the Egyptian fear of judgment in the afterlife created a market for an entirely new type of amulet, one designed to offset the bad deeds done during life and ensure entry into the afterlife. But honestly, what dead people do with their amulets isn't really of concern to us in this corporeal realm. I want to talk about the use of magical symbols in day-to-day life. The Egyptian practice of wearing amulets remained unwavering for a very long time, well into the Ptolemaic and Roman periods in Egypt, covering a span of almost 5,000 years. There are definite shifts in the styles and uses of amulets over that long stretch of time, with the earliest amulets taking the shape of animals and representations of deities being incredibly rare before around 1500 BCE. The late period, around 600 to 300 BCE, saw a huge boom in those aforementioned funerary amulets, with new varieties of amulets popping up that were specifically to benefit the deceased, not the living. Although I should note that while specific funerary amulets obviously existed, an amulet worn by the living could also be appropriate for the deceased, and some of the amulets found in burials were likely also something worn by the person before their death. Generally, amulets worn in life tend to be on the smaller side, while larger funerary amulets, like the elaborate inscribed heart scarabs, could be quite a bit larger. It makes me very happy to know that there are some symbols from ancient Egypt that are instantly recognized and still worn with some of the original intention and purpose today. The scarab, the wedjat or Eye of Horus, and the ankh. And with that, I think we have a good place to earmark our conversation about jewelry as magical symbol in the ancient world. So far, we've covered a lot of ground to establish what distinguishes jewelry as adornment from jewelry as magic, which for now is not much, actually. But on the next episode, we are going to get into some real fuckery, discussing the ancient Greeks and Romans, and some of their cultural neighbors, like the Scythians and Thracians, where we completely lose the plot and get into the whirlwind of jewelry as high art and a symbol of extreme status and wealth, while maintaining its importance as a symbol of reverence and devotion to gods and goddesses. I'll be folding Ptolemaic and Roman-era Egypt into this discussion because I think that culturally the use of jewelry is more in line with that of the Hellenistic world than the ancient Egyptian one, and I think the melding of Hellenistic and Egyptian religions in jewelry is a fascinating topic that deserves a little more attention. The melding of the Greco-Roman pantheons with the Egyptian one is an explosive combination, resulting in potent magic and symbolism. I know, half an hour of talking and it feels like we have barely scratched the surface. We've only covered a tiny portion of the ancient cultures that wore jewelry as magical symbols, and we have so much more to cover. Fortunately, we are now out of the weeds of establishing the earliest histories, and we can start to get into the weird cults, the strange beliefs, the enduring symbols that have followed us into the modern world, all coming up on the next episode. If you enjoyed this episode of the podcast, please leave me a rating and review wherever you're listening to this. I love it when people leave me ratings and reviews. Unless you didn't like this episode of the podcast, then keep it to yourself and, I don't know, maybe go listen to someone else's podcast instead. If you like what you heard and you want to watch my video series, you can find me on YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok under moonhoney.tv. jewelry. If you would like to see my work, the jewelry that I make, which is often historically inspired, you can find that at shopmoonhoney.com. If you want to see the merch, you can find it at merch.shopmoonhoney.com with more pieces to be added throughout the week. And if you want to join me on Patreon, that's patreon.com/ancient history jewelry stories. If you join at the $5 a month tier, then you will be able to vote in polls for future episode and deep dive topics, as well as get a bonus video every month. You can also join for free. There currently aren't any perks besides making me happy every time I see someone join, but hopefully there will be some Patreon exclusive merch in the future. Once again, thank you all for listening, and I'll see you here for the next episode, and of course, more ancient history jewelry stories.